Hey, 7th graders, how is it going? Today we're going to be looking a little bit more at our fantasy writing packet here today. Hopefully you're feeling pretty good about this project and at least a little bit excited. I can tell you that I'm at least tentatively a hairpin excited for this project. Up till this point, you should have read through these first couple of pages. You should have gone through Prewriting 1. You should have came up with 2 elements for your magic elements to make this fantasy, or your non-existent creatures, or whatever your non-existing setting is. Make sure that you have a couple elements of that here. Please remember that the more surreal you make it, the more you're going to have to work to try and connect it to humanity. Because if you are too fantasy-y, it becomes just ridiculous and people won't like to follow it as well. So keep your fantasy elements under control. Remember that a good plot is a good plot, no matter if it's a fantasy story or a historical fiction story. It doesn't make a difference. And we'll talk about that today a little bit. You should have filled in pre-writing 2. I'm hoping that you filled in at least 1 character, and then maybe you did a couple more ones as you were going through. These characters, or these character charts that you filled in will be essential to our writing. So please keep track of these and look back to these as frequently as you can when you are scripting out your plot and writing your paper, because these things that you did, your personalities, your motivations, your abilities and skills, all of those different elements should factor into what your character does and when your character does it, and it will be an important part of this entire story. So please make sure that you keep this in the back of your mind as you're going through. If you need to, you can change it later. If as you're writing you find that you want to toss in a flaw here that's going to be really important to the story, that's a-okay. This does not have to stay the same. You can move it around wherever you really want to. Right? Try to script out a couple of characters if you can. If not, you really only need 1 for your main character. But you might want to have a couple other ones that are at least filled in a little bit for essential things. Like, for example, if you have a main bad guy, or if you have a good versus evil struggle, that would be an important thing. Next, we're going to move on to pre-writing 3. All right, this is the next step for you, and this step is all about the setting. So what you're going to do here is you're going to work a little bit on what the setting of your story is going to be. I'm going to ask you to just look and see and think about where the story is going to take place. You may have multiple. I'm going to ask you to have at least 2 locations, but you can add on more if you want to. And the goal is, in your 2 locations, to at least describe what's going on. Now, the reason that I want you to describe these here is that you don't forget to describe things in your actual paper, right? A lot of times when we do fantasy writing, I end up with this event happened, they went here, they went there, the blank, the blank, the blank, and it just keeps on rolling and rolling. It's very difficult to follow. It's going to be very important for you to stop and think about how things look, smell, feel, and sound when you are writing. Right? So you might need to take a break here or there, step back, and say, okay, what does this place look like? Because how the place looks should be important to the story as well. I want you to come up with 2 locations. The locations, they don't have to be as specific as this, the marshy swamps of Mataror, or whatever it is. You could just write a plane, or a house, or a specific type of building, or it could be as specific as this, that it's something that you made up. And then finally, describe things. You do not have to write it like I did in a paragraph. If you're a person that's a big fan of bullet points and you want to just put bullet points or put dashes and just put ideas of what's going to be there, do it. These descriptions should help set the setting for your story. Your story should take place in at least 2 locations. If you are writing, or if you're scripting out these locations and thinking about your story, you're like, wow, I want way more than just 2 locations. All you have to do is if you click in this box and press the tab button, it'll add another row. Or if you right click and you press insert row below, it'll toss another row right there for you. So if you want to add in more locations than just these 2, add more onto your chart and you can do it yourself. All right? So step number 1, the next step for you is think about your character, think about the story that you want to tell, and write down the locations that you want your story to take place, and then describe those locations. Give me some context for your story. What do things look like? What do things smell like? How do things feel? How do things sound? All right? Once you have an idea of where your setting is going to take place, it is time for us to start plotting out the actual plot of our story. You guys have probably talked about plot lots and lots and lots, so I'm just going to briefly review it and walk through the plot line that I'm going to ask you to use. Because we're writing a relatively short story, your plot probably isn't going to have a ton of twists and turns here and there because you really don't have that many words. If you want to write more words and make it that big, you can, but with a smaller paper, you're not going to get a lot of that in there. All right? There are essentially 5 elements that I'm going to ask you to include. You're going to have to include an exposition, the rising action, a climax, some falling action, and then finally a resolution. If you don't know what those words mean, there's a little definition right here, but I'll help you just through a couple of these. Tougher ones. The exposition just means, hey, I want you to set up your story. So tell me where it takes place. Tell me who the characters are. When I say tell me who the characters are, I don't want you to write, John is a 10-year-old boy with brown hair and who loves to blank, 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 blank. I don't want it that way, but start off your story with your main character and then, like we talked about, describe what he looks like without saying, John is tall. John has brown hair, all right? Be a little bit inventive. Say, John brushes his hair away from his eyes, all right? Work on how to develop an exposition. Give me some idea about your story. Then you'll have the rising action, all right? On this, I don't necessarily include it, but I put the word down here. Conflict is what we're looking for. You are looking for your main character to be going through some sort of conflict. There should be a problem that they are facing. That could be a literal problem, like an actual bad guy, or it could be more of like an intellectual problem. It could be a conflict within himself, right? He doesn't know what to do with his new powers, right? You've read stories that are like that. Like Harry Potter, if you think about the initial conflict in the first couple of stories, yeah, there were bad guys, but it was almost an internal conflict going on. So what you want to do is you want to have your exposition, and then you want to introduce the conflict. After you have introduced the conflict, which is just the main challenge that's going on in your story, you're going to have the rising action. The rising action just means after your conflict, you need to build up events that are going to happen. What happens in this conflict? How does the conflict get worse? What makes it, how does it develop? What changes? And then finally, once you have included that rising action, this will usually be the longest part of your story because you're still talking about who your character is and introducing other characters and introducing more things about the conflict. Put little plot twists in here, something's a little bit different than it seems. And then finally, you should arrive at the climax here. The climax is the moment in your story when the conflict is resolved. That thing that you set up here at the beginning now comes to resolution at the very end. That is your climax. Once you've had the climax of the story, you can then move into the following action, which are just the events that happen after the climax. And finally, the resolution is where you leave me with your fairy tale ending. That's where you just basically say, hey, this is how the story ends. All right, the conflict is completely removed. Now, if you really want to, you can include a hook into, sorry, not a hook, a cliffhanger into the end of this resolution, but it should be done tactfully. If I look at your paper and it sounds like you just stopped writing because you were bored of writing and you had exactly the word requirement, I'm going to say you didn't really resolve the story. But if you want to include a cliffhanger, that's fine. Just do it tactfully. Do it with reason and the right way. All right, let's look a little bit more. The conflict is here. This will be the most important thing for you to include. Please, if you are confused about a conflict, ask me questions. Look at this right here because the conflict will be the essential part to your story. If you don't have a solid conflict, then it's going to be tough for you to get to a climax. It's going to be tough for you to build action. All right? So come up with a clear conflict. And then once you've done that, once you've thought about how your story is going to happen, what events are going to happen, start plugging it into this chart right here. Same deal as before. You're not writing your story here. This could just be bullet points. This just can be dashes. It can be whatever you want. It can be sentences if you're a sentence writer. But write what the exposition is. So you might write, characters start in a forest. Tom and Michael are best friends. Tom has the power to shoot lightning bolts out of his forehead. I don't know. Whatever it's going to be, write that in the exposition. Right? Then move into the rising action. So what events, there should probably be 4 or 5 of these here. What events are going to lead to this climax, right? This exposition should include the conflict here. So include your conflict here. In this rising action, you should include all of the events that talk about this conflict that lead up to your climax. Your climax is going to be, hey, when does the conflict become resolved? That could be, if it's an internal conflict, when does the character faces demons? Or if it's an external conflict, like they're a bad guy, it could be a big bad guy fight, whatever it happens to be in your story. Write down some of the events that you want to be in your following action, and then finally include your denouncement. Essentially, how is the story going to resolve? You should put a good amount of information in here. So if you're writing this, there probably should be 5 or 6 points for each of these. There should be way more in the exposition, rising action, and the climax than probably down here in these events. But get this written out as well as possible, because once you actually start writing this paper, I promise you that having this laid out will make your life so much easier, because if you get stuck when you're writing, you can just go back and go, okay, the next event that I'm trying to get to is blank, right? It really helps you line things up. So take your time when you're doing this, keep up with this, think back as you are writing those to your characters. How could your characters be involved? Is one of their flaws going to be essential to this, right? And write it into your plot line. All right, that's your task for this week. So please make sure you're keeping up on this. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right, guys, good luck.